to ask you a bit about a communication plan and what that might look like when going through any sort of digital transformation. Can you give us some outlines or some best practices around what a communication plan should look like?
Yeah, so in general, you want to focus on a two-way communication plan. So it shouldn't just be communicating to people. It's also gathering input or feedback from different stakeholders and groups throughout the organization. So that's the first thing to note, is that it's not just one way, it's two way. And then you also want to build a pretty diverse communication plan that reaches people in different ways, just because everyone within an organization is going to learn differently and disseminate information differently. So you want to have a pretty diverse plan that lays out what the messaging is, the timing of the messaging, what the what's the word I'm looking for, the vehicle or the mechanism for communicating, whether it's email or video or in-person meetings or shop floor meetings, whatever the case may be. You want to have a diverse plan, or at least a solid plan for how you're going to address those diverse needs. And then there's the other part to note is it's important to, in addition to how you communicate and the timing of the messaging, it's also important to note what you message and the things that you want to, the things you want to focus on are not just project specific, because a lot of times organizations or teams think that we just need to communicate the milestones and what's next in the project. And that stuff's important, but what's even more important to most people in the organization is going to be, what does this mean to me? How's it going to affect my job? How's it going to affect my team? How's it going to affect our location, our department, our work group, whatever it is? And so the messaging needs to be tailored, highly tailored and targeted for those different groups throughout the organization. So in general, that's what a communication plan should address, is all the things that I just mentioned.
Right. So let's start at the beginning and unpack that. So how would you go about, as organizational leaders, understanding what type of communication plan or what your communication culture looks like? I assume there needs to be some sort of assessment so that they understand the best ways or most effective ways for the organization to communicate any of these upgrades or changes. Would you say that's right?
Yeah. So that's a good point. The upfront, I think we talked about organizational assessment last time. That organizational assessment should also be capturing information about how people prefer to be communicated to or with. And some, everyone, not everyone, but a lot of organizations think that if I just send emails out,
right,
give some updates over email, everyone's going to see it, everyone's going to understand, everything's great. But the reality is, a lot of us don't read emails, myself included. I'm not good at reading emails, as you well know, working with me, but or at least not in a timely way. So you have to think about people like me or others out there that maybe they just don't communicate well via email. Maybe they just prefer to meet or to acquire information in person or via video, whatever the case may be. There's also, you also have to remember that for a lot of organizations, especially ones that have blue collar workers, people working on a shop floor or in a warehouse, they're not checking their emails that often. Typically, they're out doing real work. So how do you reach those people? And oftentimes it's those people, they're going to make or break a project. So while you're, sitting in an ivory tower, sending emails to people that are likely only going to really get through to sort of the corporate office staff, how are you reaching those other nooks and crannies of the organization that are arguably the most important parts of your organization that don't communicate in traditional ways, or at least in, they don't necessarily communicate in the same ways that office staff do. So you really have to tailor for the type of person, the type of group, the culture of the organization, and use those mechanisms that have worked best in the past for that team or that organization.
Absolutely. And you touched a little bit on listening, but I'd really like to know your feedback on how do you essentially listen throughout the communication strategies, and how important is that step?
Oh, it's critical. To answer the last part first, it's a critical step because what we as project team members view as reality, or what we think is actually happening, oftentimes is completely wrong. And what I mean by that is, if we're sitting in a conference room laying out what a business process should look like, we might think, okay, that accomplishes our goals and objectives, we can move on to the next phase. But the reality is that the people that really know whether or not that's going to work are the people that do the work every day. So a lot of the listening is not necessarily just asking people, what do you think? Or, tell me what you think about this project, or, tell me what you want to know. It's not necessarily that. It's more asking, getting people's involvement in the process so that they can provide input in a, I don't want to say an informal way, because it can be very structured and formal, but not feel structured and formal. So you're more engaging people to comment on, how a business process works, or provide feedback on a business process, for example, or help us understand how this process looks different from your current process, so that we can start to articulate those differences and start to, bake that into our training, for example. So it's not necessarily, I've seen a lot of change teams that'll say, okay, we're going to sit down with this department next week, and we're going to ask them what they think about this project. And, you could do that, but I don't know that it really matters, because first of all, that a lot of those groups don't know enough about the project to have a strong opinion.
Mhm.
Second of all, it's not a project-based discussion. It's more, help us understand your job, help us understand how your job might be affected by this process. So that's one way, is just, I would say it should be multiple touch points. It should be frequent. It should be relatively informal, mixed with formal ways of
Mhm.
communicating. And the involvement and buy-in from different stakeholders at different levels in different parts of the organization is critical.
Right. That's all really great information. And I also want to go back to the other aspect you touched on in your overview, which is the communication of changes of roles and responsibilities. Because I assume that can be a really sensitive, or can stimulate a lot of fear, which then ultimately leads to resistance and other things that could be disruptive to your overall project. So can you share some ways that you've seen be successful when talking about changing of job functions?
Yeah. So the first thing is to fully recognize and appreciate the way things are today. As change consultants or change leaders, oftentimes we want to just jump ahead to what is that future state? What are we going to look like in the future? We're moving on from this current state, so let's not dwell on it. Let's move on. And there is some truth to that. You don't want to overanalyze the current state, because you are going to change it. But you have to appreciate that the entire organization has been built around those current processes, and a lot of people's pride and value to the organization has been built around those processes. So you can't just rip it out from underneath them. So you do have to understand it from a human perspective, but also from a execution and operational enablement perspective. You have to know where you are today to be able to enable new processes, or else you're sort of shooting in the dark. So those are the two ways I would say, is to recognize the importance of the current state, understand the current state, and then start to paint a picture of the vision for the future with those key stakeholders and people throughout the organization.
Gotcha. And can you share a story or a case study of some client work you've done that you've experienced effective communication, and then also one maybe where you've seen a communication breakdown or failure?
Yeah. So, I'll have to go back a few years, back to when I was actually doing more of the hands-on consulting myself. But one of the ones earlier in my career was for a large gas and electric utility that it was a unionized environment, very entrenched in their ways of doing things. It's a highly, it had been a highly regulated industry, at least in the United States, and had become somewhat deregulated, over the years. And so they were really trying to change the business to kind of get into the modern times. And so, on the one hand, they had this vision for the future of where they wanted to be as a leadership team. But on the other hand, you had sort of an organization with a lot of tenure, staff that's been around for a long time, and people that are pretty well set in their ways. And then you had the union on top of that, sort of resisted changes, or at least made it more difficult to change in some cases. So that was one where we created a really detailed communication plan that covered, every department you can imagine, what the impacts of the organization were going to be. When I say we, I mean, it wasn't us just pushing the stuff onto the different parts of the organization. We were involving people from the organization, different parts of it, to define what it is going to be. So that was the first step, was the involvement of all these different stakeholders and frontline employees. Then we developed just working with those same people, defining how are we going to communicate this to your peers, these changes, and how are we going to get them involved, and what's the best way to communicate it, what's the best timing, what's the best way for them to learn this information. And we built the whole communications and training plan around those activities. So that was an example of a good one, because we it was very micro targeted, I would say. So we were targeting different groups very specifically. And then I've unfortunately seen a lot of bad ones, teams that just don't have time or don't think to communicate, or they make the common mistake of thinking that we as a project team are sitting in this war room all day, every day together, however many days a week. And we understand this also, therefore everyone else throughout the organization must understand what's going on as well. And it's always hard to advise clients that think that way, because they'll oftentimes not understand that people don't understand the project the same way they do. And I guess it's hard to pinpoint one failure, just because so many failures that we're hired to recover or clean up involve communication, poor communication plans. And I'd say the biggest, if I just maybe just summarize some themes rather than one specific example, some themes among those challenges or failed communications would be: one, not fully understanding the level of awareness of the rest of the organization. Because when these projects get going and they get stressful, you sort of end up in your own little bubble as a team. You're just trying to hit milestones, you're trying to make progress, and you don't always recognize or see how other people perceive what's happening. And so you just have to think outside of that and say, okay, I have to assume that people don't know this stuff, and it's okay to assume that. And if you're wrong, that's a lower price to pay than than if you're wrong and they do know more than you think. That's okay. That's a better problem to have. So that's the big thing, is not understanding the knowledge of your audience. The other thing is just, I'd say the other big one is that project communications teams that focus too much on just project updates. So we're going to send out mass emails to whoever about, yay, everything's going great. Here's our milestones. Here's how great it's going to be for the company. That's all good, I guess. But honestly, that communication, I think, is more, it makes you as a project team feel better than it actually makes the organization feel better. So you really have to think about what do they really want to hear? They don't really care about the project. You hate to say it, but they don't really care about all the work you're doing, or what the milestones are. They do care only to the extent that it's going to affect them. So tell me when I'm going to train. Tell me what the changes in my organization or my job are. I don't care necessarily that it's going to increase shareholder value or it's going to maximize profits. I might care a little bit. Some people will care, certainly, but what people care about more is for them individually, their peers, their immediate work groups. How is this project going to affect them? So that's the biggest mistake I think project teams make, in addition to the first one I mentioned, which is they assume that people want to hear about the project. And that's not true. So.
Sure. So regarding that employee-focused experience, how does training actually fit in to a communication plan or strategy for a digital transformation?
Well, training is very important, and it should be part of your communications plan. But I think the big mistake, or the big pitfall to watch for, is that training plan shouldn't just be focused on sort of your end user training right before go live. I mean, you want to be doing as much as you can, pulling as much as you can up front or earlier in the project. And you don't want the training itself to be a surprise to people. Like you shouldn't be revealing big gotchas or big ahas during end user training. That's the worst time to deliver big messages like, oh, guess what, Kyler, we're going to automate half of your job and now it's going to be done in the system. And you don't have to do the spreadsheet and the manual stuff you did before. That's not the time to be having that conversation. You should have had that conversation months before you get to end user training, because Kyler's probably going to freak out temporarily when she finds out that part of her job's getting automated or that her job is materially changing. That stuff you want to work through early on as soon as you can, even if you don't know all the details of how it's going to look or how the system's going to work. That's okay. You don't need to know, but what you need to know is how people are going to be affected. So you want to work through all that stuff first. And then by the time you get to end user training, it should be somewhat anticlimactic in that, yeah, I get it. You already told me how my job's changing. Now I want to know, how am I going to do it? Give me the tactics of how I'm going to do all the things you already told me I'm going to have to do now. And that's the way to treat or to view training. So it's not that you necessarily do training per se earlier in the project, but it goes back to that communication piece of it, where you sort of are training people on a new business process, on new roles and responsibilities. There's all this other training you can do well before you get to the system training. And the system training is honestly the easiest part. It's the part that companies focus honestly too much on. They should be focusing more on the people and process aspect of training versus just focusing on technology.
Right. I think that's a great point, that a lot of times the training plan is the communication plan. And based on what you're saying, that's not at all how that should work. It's similar to, letting the strategy lead the technology, well, letting the strategy also lead the training, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. And so when we talk about, because usually the goal is user adoption, right? Whatever percentage that means, or transforming the way that your technology influences or functions throughout the organization. So how do you make sure within this communication plan that you're setting expectations like, hey, we have a new system, we will be using the new system, and kind of communicate the what's in it for me, or the carrot of stick type approach, in making sure that people are actually utilizing the new technology?
Yeah, good question. Most people, at the end of the day, I'd say probably 95% or more of people in most organizations want to change. They're willing to change, I should say. Where they get into trouble and where employees start to resist is when they don't understand or know what exactly the change is for them. So that's where, a prerequisite to all the stuff we're training about, that we're talking about with communications and training, is that you need to have a clear vision or a clear organizational design for what roles and responsibilities are going to be. Nothing's going to cause resistance more than all these cool technologies that are going to automate someone's job or take parts of someone's job away. Even if that's best for the organization, even if you could eventually sell them on the idea that this is best for the organization, they're still human, and they still are going to view that as a threat, especially when you don't replace or don't give a vision of what's it going to look like on the other side. You just told me you're automating 50% of my job. What am I going to do with my other 50%? And it's amazing to me how many organizations and teams haven't really thought that through. And they think, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, we're putting in a new technology here. We're not here to redefine your job. Well, you should be. I mean, that's the whole point of technology, is to reorganize and to refine processes, optimize processes, all that stuff. So I think that's a really big problem that teams struggle with, is they don't have that clear understanding of what that organizational design is going to be and how people's jobs are going to be impacted.
Absolutely. I mean, that's huge. And when we're talking about impact, and I'd like to transition to talking about kind of change impact, when we understand there's a communication plan and it's going to have some sort of influence, whether positive or negative, on the overall company culture, the employee experience, and just our overall processes. So can you just maybe explain to us, how does a change in process impact the actual community that might be working on that process? Say you are working on the front lines of a manufacturing company, and a change in the way that you melt plastic to make a certain part. How does that change impact the people that are involved?
Yeah, so it's going to affect people in a lot of different ways. I mean, it is actually a good example. It's a good micro example that you give, because that one little change may be the optimal solution for the organization and for its manufacturing processes. Let's assume that's true. Well, if I'm a person that's on the manufacturing shop floor now, I've got to change the way I do things, everything from the materials I use to, how my general process looks, how I enter it in the system, all that stuff. It also affects other people too. Now my procurement group has to think differently about how they procure raw materials, because now we have a different process. And so while the system itself is going to enable that change potentially, that change isn't really going to happen unless people understand what it means to them and how they should do their jobs. So that's why mapping out an end-to-end process flow is so important. Not in the way that software vendors and system integrators typically think about it. They typically think of it as how do I define a workflow in a way that allows me to build the system. Whereas we, as internal team members from the organization that's actually implementing the technology, we have to think about it from the perspective of what is the overall process end to end, including the touch points outside of technology. By the way, there's other things that happen outside the system. So it goes well beyond the system training, back to that point, as well as what roles and responsibilities are within that and who's doing what. You have to map all that out so that you can communicate that and help people understand it. and work through that and ultimately achieve the benefits that or the changes that are expected.
Absolutely. And so we talk a lot about business process mapping or supply chain optimization and mapping. So when you go through those kind of more technical pieces of understanding your overall operations, does that human piece layer in there, or would that be kind of an afterthought?
Well, it usually is an afterthought, but that's a mistake that it happens more often than not. It should be something that's integrated, that's part of the overall process. I would argue that you should really map out your processes, the organizational design, and everything before you deploy technology. In a perfect world, that's what you do. Problem is, so many organizations get sideways in timing, and they get so much momentum and excitement behind putting in new technology that they charge ahead with the technology work stream, and they sort of leave behind all these other seemingly unimportant or less important work streams that are actually a lot more important than the technical work stream. So they end up doing things backwards and then playing catch up when it comes to the organizational and business process design, which then affects the inability or causes the inability to be able to train and communicate well, because you didn't have time, because you didn't define what the changes were, what the impacts were. So therefore you haven't been able to communicate it and train people appropriately. And then you go live and people are confused and people want to blame the technology when really it wasn't a technology problem. It was a human and operational problem.
Right. And it sounds like, based on just your feedback, when it comes to our vendor partners or our system integrators, sometimes they too can have kind of a siloed lens of what that strategy should look like, and maybe leave out some of the human aspects of change impact. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would.